Tonight we're going to talk about the CARES Act, and more specifically the waiver of required minimum distributions, and then the following guidance from the IRS that now has allowed us to roll back required minimum distributions up through the end of this month. And there's just a lot of questions that are coming out now with last minute, client calls saying, can I do this? Or what if this happens? So let's talk about that this evening. Of course, my name is Jeffrey Levine. I am the lead financial planning nerd for Kitsis.com. And for those of you that would like a transcript of this video, we'll be posting a transcript on Thursday to the Nerd's Eye View website, along with this video itself. Now, by way of background, many of you are aware, if not all of you, that we had the CARES Act, that's the stimulus bill that was passed in March of this year, March 27th to be precise. And it included lots of things such as the PPP loan, the Paycheck Protection Program loan. It included all sorts of relief in terms of healthcare expenses. But one of the other things it did was it suspended required minimum distributions for 2020 for both IRAs as well as for defined contribution plans. So things like 401ks, 403bs, thrift savings plans, etc. And while it did eliminate RMDs, the problem was it didn't get passed until March 27th, right? So you already had individuals who had taken RMDs. Remember, we're a quarter of the way through the year already. So a number of people already took their required minimum distributions earlier in the year. Similarly, there was a lot going on. If you remember back in the late March, early April, et cetera, there was a lot going on. People, in terms of their own protection, staying away from going out, or, just busy with watching their own kids at their house or their grandkids, as it were. So there were lots of reasons, advisors out of the office, that even if someone realized on March 27th that they no longer had an RMD, it may have been that over the next few weeks, few months, et cetera, that distributions, perhaps that were already scheduled, still went out, that now, in retrospect, the individual did not want. So the good news is that the IRS did give us some relief. And in fact, Congress gave us some built-in relief in the CARES Act itself in the form of a coronavirus-related distribution. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. But following the CARES Act, Congress gave us two additional bits of relief. The first came in the form of Notice 2020-23. And in that notice, Congress said, the IRS gave us the ability to roll back distributions that were taken from February 1st and on through July 15th. Now, that was good, but it had a number of problems associated with it. First off, how about those who took distributions in January, right? They were still left out in the cold, so to speak. But also, it didn't help to provide relief for those subject to the once-per-year rollover rule that applies to IRA distributions, or even for beneficiaries of retirement accounts, such as IRA beneficiaries, 401k beneficiaries, etc. So following that, later in the year, the IRS came out and they issued IRS Notice 2020-51, and that is the relief that we're going to spend the most time discussing today, because that is the piece of relief that said it specifically was targeted to retirement accounts and said if you took what would have been an RMD earlier this year, and that's key, if you took what would have been an RMD earlier this year, you can now roll back that RMD up through the end of this month, August. So through August 31st, you can roll back that RMD anytime from January 1st if it was taken on. And notably, that did a number of things. Not only did it allow for those January distributions that are unwanted now to be rolled back, but more precisely, what it also did was it allowed IRA owners who would have otherwise been in violation of the once-per-year rollover rule to roll back those distributions as well. In addition, it allowed beneficiaries to roll back distributions. And that caught a lot of people off guard because it was well understood, or at least it was well believed by most experts in this area, that that both of those things would require congressional action, which did not occur. And yet the IRS was able to offer that relief, and certainly it's not gone challenged as who would want to fight that. Nevertheless, that relief that applied to those distributions taken earlier this year, or those distributions that would have been subject to the once per year rollover rule, or those distributions that were for beneficiaries. That relief expires at the end of this month, and that has spurred a lot of last-minute questions with respect to this rollover guidance. So one of the first is, what if I miss the deadline? Now, that's not really great. We've had about 2 months or so to follow through on this relief. But having said that, if you do miss the deadline, there still may be some potential to roll back additional distributions. Now, the key thing is once the deadline is missed, the regular rules will generally apply. So for argument's sake, if your distribution is more than 60 days in the past, you're likely going to be unable to roll that distribution back. If your distribution would be a violation of the once per year rollover rule, well, after August 31st of this month, after August 31st, can't do it. If your distribution is from an inherited IRA or inherited 401k or other inherited defined contribution plan, after this month, if you haven't finished that, you're not going to be able to do so. And there's only one exception to this rule, and that would be for IRA owners or 401k owners or retirement account owners, not beneficiaries, who would otherwise be eligible for a coronavirus-related distribution. This is another provision from the CARES Act that said if you were fiscally or physically impacted by the virus, and we'll include a link to a larger article about this if you want more information. But in short, if you were diagnosed, or your spouse was diagnosed, or a dependent was diagnosed with the virus, or if you or a spouse were impacted financially because you lost a job, or you had hours cut back, you had pay cut back, you had to stay home because you had to watch your kids, or that happened to a member of your household, then you're eligible to take what's called a coronavirus-related distribution. And one of the notable benefits of those distributions is that you can roll back the distribution for up to 3 years. So presumably, even if you missed the deadline, the August 31st deadline, but your client, let's say, was diagnosed with COVID earlier this year, or now, or even some point later this year, they would be able to take that early year distribution and put it back in as a valid rollover up through 3 years from the date of distribution or the date of receipt of that distribution. So that would still be on the table. Of course, that only applies to a relatively small subsection of people. Certainly, given the pandemic, it's not entirely small, but it's still a minority of the retired public who would otherwise be eligible to put back distributions, right? Again, you'd need to be diagnosed with the virus or have a fiscal impact as I described. Now, another question that's come up repeatedly is, Jeff, I took more than the RMD earlier this year, but now I'd like to roll that back. Can I do so? And unfortunately, the answer is no, unless you're within the normal rollover rules. In other words, you're still within 60 days, etc. But typically, this question is being asked by someone who maybe took a larger distribution in March of this year and now doesn't need it anymore. And they don't want not only their RMD, but they want the excess that they took out beyond the RMD to be put back. And unfortunately, the guidance contained in Notice 2020-51 is rather specific and talks specifically about essentially if it wasn't for the CARES Act, the distribution that would have been an RMD can be rolled back over. But it's very precise about that. Talks about the distribution that would have been an RMD but for the CARES Act. And so amounts taken beyond the RMD are generally not eligible for this guidance. And perhaps the question that I have been asked most often lately is what happens if my client took an in-kind distribution earlier this year to satisfy their required minimum distribution? Amazingly, that's cropped up probably a dozen times or so from advisors in just the last week. I've been asked that. And the question is in large part like, hey, my client took a distribution when the property value was low earlier this year. They didn't want to sell it, so we distributed it in kind, and now it's gone back up in value. How do we do this? What's the rule? Do we have to sell it and put back in the same amount of value? Is it the same amount of stock? And as it turns out, with respect to IRAs, there's what's called the same property rule, which means what came out of the IRA needs to go back into the IRA in order to satisfy a full rollover. Now, the value that came out of the IRA may not be the same as what goes back in. More specifically, unless we're talking about cash, it's almost certainly not, right? Because if you took $100,000 of cash out earlier this year to satisfy an RMD, and certainly that would be a large RMD, but you get the point, you could put back, or you would have to put back $100,000 in cash in order for that rollover to be considered complete. However, if you took stock that had dropped dramatically in value, and it was worth, let's say, $40,000 at the time of your distribution, but now since the market has rebounded, let's just say it's back up at $75,000. Well, the $75,000 that goes back into the account right now, it's not a dollar amount. It has to be the same property. So you must take the same shares, the same number of shares that came out earlier of the same stock, and put back in those same shares. The fact that it's worth $75,000 now doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's the same property that came out of the retirement account, out of the IRA, needs to go back into the IRA. So sometimes, in some cases, people have experienced a rebound and maybe they would have sold that property outside of the IRA already. Well, in order to complete a rollover, you've actually got to buy the same amount of shares back first and roll them back in. Again, it's the same property rule. In essence, the way I would explain this, or suggest you think about it, is that if you're going to complete the rollover, the IRA should be put back in the same position that it would have been in had a distribution never taken place. So for argument's sake, if you had 100 shares of ABC stock that came out earlier this year and was valued at $40,000, well, if you never did the distribution in the first place and the IRA held on to that ABC shares this entire time, the IRA would have enjoyed that appreciation. And so it shouldn't be penalized, so to speak, if you take out that, if you took out that distribution earlier this year. So that's the rule with IRAs. Now, I've heard of some advisors telling me that they've already made a mistake and they've put back cash equal to the original distribution. Or some people have put back cash equal to the value that the shares appreciated to, and kind of a weird combination of rules that isn't at all correct. And what needs to happen there is twofold. First off, if you want to complete this rollover, you need to get those shares back in by that August 31st deadline, right? That's absolutely critical for an early year distribution. You only have until August 31st. So the shares or whatever property was distributed from the IRA needs to go back in kind by that August 31st deadline. The second part of this is that the cash that went in, well, that actually represents an impermissible rollover. It's an excess contribution, and that needs to be removed in order to avoid a 6% penalty. Now, the good news is you've got some time for that. That fix, if you will, doesn't need to happen until October 15th of next year. You take out the cash plus or minus the earnings that were attributable to it during the time it was in the account. Now, would I actually wait until October 15th of next year? No, because you'll have other headaches to deal with at that point. I would do it as soon as possible. But the point being, the priority here has to be on getting the same property, the same shares, the same bonds, the same real estate, whatever it was distributed, the same property goes back into the IRA to finish that rollover. Absolutely critical. Now, for those of you that had clients that took distributions from plans, and maybe those plan distributions were sold in the interim, there is an exception to this same property rule that applies to plan distributions, which simply says if you sold the asset, you can take the proceeds and roll them back over. But if it was an IRA distribution, it must be the same property. So again, IRAs, same property. With plans, it could be the same property, or if it was sold in the interim, you can take the proceeds of that sale and roll that over to complete the rollover itself. Finally, a lot of individuals have asked me, Jeff, do you see more relief on the way from the IRS? Will they further extend this deadline? And while it is entirely possible that at some point later this year, Congress will include some relief in some sort of bill, or the IRS will come out with something else, they've already very precisely targeted retirement accounts with the guidance that was afforded under Notice 2020-51 earlier this year. And they provided historic relief by not only giving individuals extra time, but by extending that relief to individuals who had once per year rollover rules and to beneficiaries of retirement accounts. So I would not count on relief. I think it's entirely possible that we've seen the best the IRS has to offer in this area, and Congress does not go down this road themselves. They've got other big things to worry about beyond just being an election year. They've got another stimulus package to pass, et cetera. So I would not count on that. Now, that said, earlier today, I posted a quick memo that we'd be having this live discussion, and a couple of individuals did reach out with questions. More specifically, and I'm going to try and get this name right, Venetius asked earlier today, how will IRA repayments and rollovers of RMDs be reported by custodians, if at all? And the reporting there is going to look like any other type of rollover. So the distributing account is going to issue a 1099-R, and the receiving account will ultimately issue a 5498. Now, it's worth noting that the 5498 typically doesn't arrive until after the client files their tax return, if they're filing it in a timely manner by the April 15th typical deadline. And so it's really up to you and your client to let the CPA, the tax preparer, or whoever's doing that return, let them know that this is in fact a rollover, an RMD, that this money went back in. What you'll generally see is you'll see a gross distribution on like on line 4A of the tax return, or whatever line it happens to be next year. On line 4B, you'd see it say 0, assuming the full rollover was completed. And then next to it, there's an indication of RO, which simply indicates that it's a rollover. It's what lets the IRS know why the gross distribution is not taxable on the client's return. So that is done at the individual level, not at the custodial level. They will still report this with a 1099-R, so it will need to be explained away by the client on the tax return. Another question came in from Levi, and he said, I still can't get my head around this situation for a client. My client was an IRA owner who died in January, and the RMD was distributed to the spouse monthly in January, February, March, and April of this year from the deceased IRA owner's IRA. The spouse then settled the IRA to their own IRA. I'm assuming this is just meant as a spousal rollover. Can the spouse now return the RMDs to their own IRA? And I would say this is an incredibly gray area, so don't feel badly by that you haven't wrapped your head around this. No one really has, because there's no clear guidance here. My thought process here is that in general, you're not going to be able to do that. You typically can't complete a rollover for the decedent. And if you can, the IRS has allowed that in various private letter rulings over the years. However, every time they've done so, they've treated the money that was rolled back as having no designated beneficiary. Meaning, if it has no designated beneficiary, the spouse wouldn't be able to do that rollover anyway. So I think that's unlikely. What I've seen in a kind of variation of this, in fact, I answered a question earlier today just before coming on to do this video, was a question from an advisor who said, Jeff, my client died early in January before taking their RMD. Everything was moved as a spousal rollover to the spouse, and then the spouse took the deceased IRA owner's RMD this year, or what they thought was an RMD. Can we roll that back? And that, I think the answer there is yes. So the key question is, whose social security number was this tied to? That, I think, is really going to be the critical question here. So you might, in your case, be able to make an argument if it was tied to the surviving spouse's social security number that they had already, quote unquote, elected to treat the account as their own, in which case the tax consequences are entirely the same as if they had done a spousal rollover, except there's actually no transaction that's done by that point. It's simply an election by the spouse. It's a little bit more of a, I hate to say aggressive argument, but it's a little bit more on the creative side. And given the relatively small amount that's involved here, it's probably not worth looking for trouble, but it's a great question. So with that, I want to thank those of you who have joined me tonight. If you've got additional questions, love to hear them. Always love to see what's going through the minds of advisors. Hit us up at kitces.com. Again, a transcript of this video, along with the video itself, will be posted this Thursday. So you can grab that if you've missed anything or you want to hear something again. And of course, you can always tweet at me at CPA Planner on Twitter or connect on LinkedIn. Thanks so much. Wish all of you the best of success, health, and happiness for the rest of 2020 and beyond. Take care, everyone. Have a great night.